Last time we were talking a little about the polity of Deuteronomy and what distinguishes it from other structures, governmental structures you may know. We had just finished talking about the law of the king in chapter 17. The king in Deuteronomy land has absolutely nothing to do except, not surprisingly, to read the book of Deuteronomy. So that the king will be adequately instructed on what to do and how to do it. The question then arises if decisions judicially are made at the lowest possible level, that is, they are made in the towns, in the individual lineages. And so what do you do if you can't appeal to the king in the instance that you don't know exactly what it is that you're supposed to do, or if there is disagreement in the individual towns about what kind of decisions ought to be made legally? Deuteronomy takes that up also in chapter 17, just before talking about the law that governs the king. So that needs to be put together with the description of the king and the fact that the king is not the court of final appeal in the judicial system. And there, Deuteronomy differs from practically every other known political structure in the ancient world, where the appeal to the ruler was the standard way of resolving judicial disputes. So how are those resolved in Deuteronomy? Well, it's not surprising to find out in chapter 17, beginning around verse 8. If there is a judicial decision that is too difficult for you to make between one type of bloodshed and another, one kind of legal right and another, or one kind of assault and another, any such matters of dispute in your towns, then you shall immediately go up to the place which the Lord your God will choose, where you shall consult with the Levitical priests and the judge who is in office in those days, and they shall announce to you the decision in the case. Carry out exactly the decision that they announce to you from the place that the Lord will choose, diligently observing everything they instruct you. You must carry out fully the law that they interpret for you, or the ruling that they announce to you. Do not turn aside from the decision that they announce to you, either to the right or the left. Anyone who presumes to disobey the priest appointed to minister there to the Lord your God, or to the judge, that person shall die. And so you shall purge evil from Israel. All of the people will hear and be afraid and will not act presumptuously again. This is the translation of the NRSV, which for Deuteronomy was done by Dean McBride, who probably knows more about Deuteronomy and its peculiar language than anyone else around. So generally the translation in NRSV is very specific and very much in context of the peculiar idiom of Deuteronomy. So if you really want to know what the import of anything in Deuteronomy is, you have to start either with the Hebrew text or with translation. In this case, I think McBride got it wrong, and the Hebrew text here is a little more ambiguous than his translation suggests. He suggests that there actually is an appellate court in the central place which the Lord will choose, and that the Levites essentially are in charge of making legal decisions. That part is correct. There is a place where you can go, but I think the ambiguity of what they are told to do there is greater than the translation suggests. The Hebrew really says, when you cannot distinguish which law applies, that is, if you are in disagreement in your local towns about whether this is a case of accidental murder or intentional murder, or if this is a case of one kind of theft or another, or one kind of wrong and another. So the basic issue in the local town is not necessarily guilt. It is the question of which law to apply. And for that kind of guidance, you go to the place which the Lord your God will choose. The Hebrew text says, they will inquire diligently. And inquire can have one of two meanings. It can mean to investigate, as investigate the case, or it can mean actually to make a judicial inquiry of the deity. So it's a technical term in some places for making an inquiry of the deity, and it would be the Levitical priest who does that in the Deuteronomic system. And in that case, the deity would then announce which law to apply, and once the deity has done that, then the people here are being exhorted to obey whatever decision it is, and that is the reason for, I think, for the rigidity of the having to obey the decision. Now, so what you need to notice here is that there is some ambiguity about it. Many people take it in the same way that the NRSV takes it, that this in fact is a court of last judicial appeal. I don't really think that is the case. I think the case, once it is announced which law applies, the case probably goes back to the local town for adjudication in the normal way, because that would then fit in with what we know about the rest of the judicial system. In any case, Deuteronomy is not self-interpreting, so there were presumably arguments about exactly this sort of thing. We move on in our survey of the Great Society according to the Deuteronomists in chapter 18, and not surprisingly, having invoked the importance of the Levitical priests and having provided for their care and maintenance, given the absence of these local shrines where they apparently previously worked until Deuteronomy centralized the judicial system, or centralized the worship system, rather. So what do they have to tell us about the Levitical priests? Not surprisingly, they are very polemical when it comes to dealing with the Levitical priests, which is probably a pretty good sign that the book of Deuteronomy has something to do with the Levitical priests, or they have something to do with it, and probably are the creators of it, and certainly the custodians of it. This raises a question which we are not going to go into on a bet in this course, namely the structure of the priesthood, which is quite complex. I'll say a little about it as we look at what Deuteronomy has to say about the Levites, which is one of the clearer places where the priesthood is referred to. But you need to know that if you really are going to deal with the complexity of the priesthood, you first of all ought to think about it very hard before you engage in that. And second, you're going to have to deal with the first 9 chapters of the First Chronicles, which is a very long and complex set of genealogies, and the most complex right in the middle is the genealogy of the priesthood. So there are more than one kind of priest. It's not a generic priesthood. Eventually they will all claim to be Levites, but that's probably a reaction to the Deuteronomy law, and was not originally the way that things were in ancient Israel, and I'll just leave it at that. But notice the way in which the law is phrased, beginning at chapter 18, the first verse. The Levitical priests, that is to say, the whole tribe of Levi. The way that is phrased suggests that there are people who are claiming that there are some members of the tribe of Levi who are not covered under this law, that there are Levitical priests running around out there that don't fit with what is being mandated here. And it's the concern of Deuteronomy to assure people that all of the Levites are to be considered legitimate priests. And that polemic will occupy much of what Deuteronomy has to say about this. So we've got a dispute going on apparently. And we'll see in a minute what the response to the Levitical law is later on in the tradition. The Levitical priests, that is to say the whole tribe of Levi, shall have no allotment or inheritance within Israel. So they don't get an allotment of land when in Joshua the land is partitioned among the different tribes. And the reason for that is that they are, first of all, spread throughout the land, and second of all, they are primarily the custodians of sanctuaries throughout the land. And that is their support. Now you will remember that Deuteronomy has centralized worship in the one place which the Lord your God will choose, which immediately raises the question of what to do with out-of-work Levites, people who used to serve these distant shrines. So that's the backdrop of this law governing how one deals with the Levites. So they shall not, they have no allotment or inheritance within Israel, but they may eat the sacrifices that are the Lord's portion. So they can function as priests at the sanctuary, and there will be an allotment to them from the offerings that are provided at the sanctuary. But what do you do if there's only one sanctuary? That's the problematic that Deuteronomy has now created. And coming from a group of Levites, this is of some concern to them. So they shall have no inheritance among the other members of the community. The Lord is their inheritance as he promised them. This shall be the priest's due from the people, from the offering of a sacrifice, whether it is an ox or a sheep. They shall give to the priest the shoulder and 2 jowls and the stomach. This is one of the few places where Deuteronomy actually indulges in the specifics of sacrifice. I mean, he contrasts this with the priestly writer, who has chapters upon chapters about how you do all this. Otherwise, Deuteronomy really doesn't seem to care, except in this one case. Deuteronomy cares where you do it, but not what you do. So you can see where the polemic is going to lie. The first fruits of your grain, your wine, and your oil, as well as the first of the fleece of your sheep, you shall give to them, that is, to the Levites. For the Lord your God has chosen Levi out of all of your tribes to stand and minister in the name of the Lord, him and his sons for all time. So the Levites in Deuteronomy are a perpetual priesthood. There is no way to change that situation. So what do we do with these poor Levites who are out here in the hinterlands at local shrines which now have been put out of business by Deuteronomy's concern with the central sanctuary? If a Levite enters any of your towns from wherever he has been residing in Israel, and he comes to the place that the Lord will choose, and he may come whenever he wishes, then he may minister in the name of the Lord his God, like all of his fellow Levites who stand to minister there before the Lord. They shall have equal portions to eat, even though they may have income from the sale of family property. So the basic answer to the question is, if they want to go to the local sanctuary, at the central sanctuary, to preside there, they may do that, and they may not be prevented from doing so, and they can do it whenever they want to do it. This, too, sounds polemical. It sounds as if whoever is in control of the local sanctuary, or the central sanctuary, is not allowing these distant Levites to come and preside on an equal basis. Notice the law's insistence on an equal share and the equal right to do it whenever an outside Levite wants to come in and do it. Otherwise, what do? They get the tithe in the 3rd year of the material that is collected, the offerings that are collected in the 3rd year. along with the other people who are dependent on that, as we saw last time when we looked at the law of the 3-year tithe. So they make provision for them in that way in 14:28 of Deuteronomy. Now, it is also possible, if you read the law of centralization in chapter 12, you also see that the Levites who have been in business at the local sanctuaries are now put out of business as priests at the local sanctuaries because the local sanctuaries have been desacralized, but they have not necessarily been destroyed. So if you want to go to your local shrine and sacrifice an animal for eating, you pay the person who does this, and the person who does it could well be the local Levite who has been doing this for a long time. You simply can't call it a sacrifice. It's like going to the meat market. And if you want to consider it that way, then presumably these local Levites can stay in business as the local butchers. Deuteronomy seems to provide that. How attractive that may be depends, I guess, on how much the priests have invested in their priesthood and whether they really want to continue to see this as a religious act rather than a secular one. So it's important to remember that Deuteronomy is desacralizing these local shrines, not necessarily eliminating them. You can do what you have always done at the local shrine, you just can't call it a religious activity anymore, according to Deuteronomy. Okay, so we notice some of the peculiarities of the Deuteronomic state when we look at this. They move on from this to something that really is quite unique to Deuteronomy, and that is a law having to do with prophets. No other piece of the Pentateuch legislates about prophets, which suggests that for the Deuteronomic system, prophets play a major role of some sort as the conduits between the human and divine worlds. Prophecy is the means which God seems to have chosen to communicate with Israel, and that is enshrined in law only here in Deuteronomy. So this seems to be an important thing, and it's going to be no surprise at all when we get to the Deuteronomistic history, particularly in Samuel and Kings. We're going to see an awful lot of references to prophets and their activities. We don't have, that's material for the second semester of this course, but I will simply say this, that any time you have prophets, we get into the question of the possibility of false prophecy. It's difficult to tell when a person announces a divine word from the deity that whether or not the deity really spoke to this person or not. That is something that the onlooker has to decide in any case where a person is making this sort of prophetic claim. And it is one of the major issues surrounding the phenomenon of prophecy. Deuteronomy is a firm believer in the existence of prophecy, but recognizes the possibility of falsehood anytime you have a claim to being a prophet. And so how is that going to be resolved? Well, one way of resolving it would be the way referred to in chapter 13 of Deuteronomy, where we are told that if a prophet arises and says, let's go worship other gods that we have not known, and then gives you a sign to guarantee the truth of that prophecy, and the sign happens. This is a sort of standard way of justifying a prophecy. We'll run into it again at the sacrifice that Jeroboam the first makes at the shrine at Bethel to inaugurate, more or less, the beginning of the northern kingdom, and according to 1 Kings 13. And we will see that in that case also there is an unnamed prophet from Judah who comes and gives a prophecy against the altar at Bethel and pronounces the end of the northern dynasty and the destruction of the sanctuary. Because this is going to happen way in the distant future, the sanctuary is going to be destroyed by King Josiah, which is a goodly distance in time away from the prophecy that is given. The prophet provides a sign to happen immediately. If the sign happens immediately, then you know that the prophecy itself is genuine. So you get a kind of down payment on the prophecy and its fulfillment. And in that case, the sign happens. That's the case that Deuteronomy 13 is also talking about. If a prophet says, let's go worship other gods, and then gives you a sign, and the sign happens, must be a divine word that we're supposed to go worship other gods. Deuteronomy says, don't believe it for a minute. God is just checking to see if you're paying attention, because God would never say anything like that to a genuine prophet. There is a content criterion for Deuteronomy. There are certain things that a true prophet cannot say. And therefore, if they say it, you know right off the bat that this is a false prophet, and you do not have to worry about it. And besides that, the person who said these things and claimed to have a prophetic word has been shown to be false and therefore deserves the death penalty. There is a death penalty for false prophecy. The same way there is a death penalty for lying in court as a witness. All right, so all of that seems to be lying behind the section in Deuteronomy on prophecy. So when you come into the land that the Lord your God is giving you, you must not learn to imitate the abhorrent practices of those nations who live there. We have already heard that from Deuteronomy. Usually, though, it has to do with the worship life. Here it has to do explicitly with the kinds of intermediaries between the human and divine worlds that these people employ to be in touch with their deities. No one shall be found among you who makes a son or daughter pass through fire. This is why this is here, I am not sure, except it is an abomination for Deuteronomy. It is a practice that seems to have taken place outside of Jerusalem, and in Israel we only have references to it there, presumably under the care of the local kings who allow this. It may or may not be related to the law of the firstborn and the giving of the firstborn to the deity, or at least that's the excuse that they make. Later on, Ezekiel will say God didn't really say that. God didn't really mean it. And if God did, God was just trying to give you a bad law to punish you. So Jeremiah just says you invented this on your own. This is not anything the deity came up with, and so on. So that is mentioned here as the sort of person who is not allowed to practice or be in existence. And also those who practice divination, a soothsayer, an augurer, a sorcerer, one who casts spells, one who consults ghosts or spirits, one who seeks oracles from the dead. Now, these are all technical terms. I won't go into what they mean. This is a fair translation. Notice that most of them have to do with necromancy, that is, being in touch with the spirits of the dead. And it seems to reflect the idea that there are these cults concerning the dead in existence in Israel. Deuteronomy will try to eliminate those as well. Later on, we will be told that people are not to perform ritual mourning of various sorts, cutting and so on behalf of the dead, as the process of worshiping the dead. So Deuteronomy generally is against these sorts of cults and sees them as a version of the worship of other deities, apparently. So these people who are engaged in contacting the dead on behalf of the living are not to be allowed in the land in Deuteronomy. Whoever does these things is abhorrent to Yahweh, because it is such abhorrent practices that the Lord your God is driving them out before you. You must remain completely loyal to Yahweh your God, although those nations that you are about to dispossess do give heed to soothsayers and diviners. As for you, the Lord your God does not permit you to do so. Okay, having ruled that out as a way of contacting the deity and having the deity contact you, what do you do? Yahweh your God will raise up for you a prophet like me. This is Moses now speaking. So there's going to be a prophet like Moses, who, it turns out, is going to be a special kind of prophet. This prophet will be from among your own people. Again, you are not to import some kind of an exotic foreigner to do this. It's got to be from among your own people. And you shall listen to that sort of prophet. This, after all, now notice how they ground this idea of the Mosaic prophet. This is what you requested of the Lord your God at Horeb on the day of assembly, when you said, if I hear the voice of the Lord my God any more, or ever again see this great fire, I will die. And the Lord replied to me, they are right in what they have said. I will raise up for them a prophet like you, Moses, from among their own people. I will put my words in the mouth of the prophet, who shall speak to them everything that I command. So the practice of prophecy is grounded here by Deuteronomy in this peculiar phenomenon that we've already observed when we looked at the Decalogue, that the Decalogue itself is given directly to the people by God. The rest of the law is mediated through Moses, and this was done because the people were terrified of hearing the voice of God again. And it's this phenomenon that this law appeals to as the justification for a successor to Moses, who will be a prophetic successor. So there is an explicit identification of what Moses did at Sinai as a form of prophecy. So that's the grounding for the notion of prophets. The prophet will have the word of God in his or her mouth. So you get the notion that the prophet transmits faithfully the divine word without modification. So I will put my words in the mouth of the prophet, who will then pass them on faithfully to everybody else. So that's the job of the prophet. The prophet is not allowed to interpret. The prophet is not allowed to intervene in passing on the message. A genuine Mosaic prophet will say only what God has said to the prophet and pass it on faithfully to the people. And for that reason, everyone who listens to that prophet has to obey, because it is, in fact, a genuine divine word from the deity. And anyone who does not listen to the words of that the prophet shall speak in my name, I myself will hold them accountable. But any prophet who speaks in the name of other gods, or who presumes to speak in my name a word that I have not commanded the prophet to speak, that prophet shall die. So there is a death penalty for false prophecy. You may say to yourself, how can we recognize a word that Yahweh has not spoken? If a prophet speaks in the name of Yahweh, but the thing does not take place or prove true, it is a word that the Lord has not spoken. The prophet has spoken it presumptuously. Do not be frightened by it. Now this contradicts chapter 13, where you have a case where the prophet speaks and then gives you a sign, which does happen. And later on, we'll see in 1 Kings 22 another case which works the same way, where God actually deliberately sends a lying spirit to one of the prophets, who then transmits that lying oracle. So this is a very, very complicated situation. But what you need to notice here is that this office of Mosaic prophet seems to be an important idea for the Deuteronomists, and it's going to play itself out later on in the history as these figures from time to time pop up. They are also a way of adjudicating what happens when prophets disagree with each other. If prophets disagree with each other, then one of them has got to be false. They can't all be right. So how do you tell which one to listen to? Well, Deuteronomy says you listen to the one who is like Moses. Well, how do you know that they're like Moses? Well, they sort of look like Moses, and they act like Moses. And when we get into Kings, we'll see some examples where the prophets are in fact portrayed doing the same kinds of things that Moses did. And this connection with Moses is very clear in the presentation of those prophets. But most particularly, they are Mosaic because the word that they say comes true. Now, the only problem is that you have to wait around for the word to come true. And with that problem in mind, we'll move on to some other topics. But we'll see how this begins to play itself out later on in the history. But this is a unique idea of Deuteronomy, and nobody else seems to care about this. I want to comment also, this is followed by the cities of refuge. The cities of refuge are another device that seems to be the result of the problem that Deuteronomy has created by centralizing worship. It was traditionally the case, and we have narratives to this effect, that in order to guard against a false accusation, someone who was an accidental killer or who is accused of killing that they did not do and is therefore liable to the death penalty could go to a sanctuary and claim sanctuary. That's the modern idiom for it. It still exists in the common law. They can go to the altar and grab the horns of the altar, the protrusions that surround an incense altar, that are on the top of the thing, these spikes that come up, or ears, or whatever you want to call them, on the top of the altar. So they can grab the horns of the altar and claim sanctuary, and they are not then supposed to be punished. This business of taking sanctuary exists in the West all the way down to the present day, in houses of worship and so on. There are many famous cases of it from the Middle Ages on in Europe, where people violated the sanctuary of the altar and were generally punished for it. We won't go into all the examples, but there are a number of them if you go looking through church history for these things. So this is the origin of it, the notion of refuge. Well, what do you do if the place that the Lord your God will choose is too far away? When you had a local altar in your town, it was easy enough to seek sanctuary. But Deuteronomy has created a legal problem here, among others, by putting the altar only at the central sanctuary. So what do you do if the central sanctuary is too far away for the person seeking sanctuary to get there? And Deuteronomy solves that problem by establishing these cities of refuge, which are places which are more easily reached, and people can then go to the city sanctuary and take refuge there, and they are supposed to have the same protections that they would get from going to the local sanctuary. So this is another example of Deuteronomy creating a problem and then later having to solve it. This brings us then to the laws on warfare, and this is important because we're going to run into it in Joshua as a major sort of issue. So how is war carried out? This seems like a silly question, but it isn't. Remember that the king does not have any power in Deuteronomy. And in the ancient Near East, kings were normally the people who led armies and conducted wars. And they had standing armies, they had chariot forces, they had the right to levy taxes and support war, and so on. The state in Deuteronomy has none of those things attached to the king. So if the king is not going to be responsible for military activity, how does warfare take place? And Deuteronomy takes that up in chapter 20. When you go out to war against your enemies and see horses and chariots, an army larger than your own, you shall not be afraid of them. Why? Because the Lord your God is with you, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. Now, notice the back reference explicitly to the Exodus and the event at the sea when God essentially fought off the Egyptians on behalf of Israel, according to the narratives that we have looked at. The Lord your God is with you, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Before you engage in battle, so this is now going to become a ritual before battle, the priest will come forward and speak to the troops, and shall say to them, Hear, O Israel, today you are drawing near to do battle against your enemies. Do not lose heart. Do not be afraid. Do not panic. Do not be in dread of them. For it is Yahweh your God who goes with you to fight for you against your enemies and give you victory. So this is indeed a divine war, according to to Deuteronomy. So it is essentially blessed, and you get this exhortatory speech by the priest, who is going to be a Levitical priest. They don't bother to repeat it every time it comes up in Deuteronomy, but priests in Deuteronomy are always Levitical priests. Then the officials shall come and address the troops and say, Has anyone built a new house but not dedicated it? He should go back to his house, or he might die in battle and another dedicate it. Has anyone planted a vineyard but has not yet enjoyed its fruit? He should go back to his house, or he might die in battle and another be first to enjoy the fruit. Has anyone become engaged to a woman but not yet married her? He should go back to his house, or he might die in battle and another marry her. And so the officials shall continue to address the troops, saying, Is anyone afraid or disheartened? He should go back to his house, or he might cause the heart of his comrades to melt like his own. So the officials get the army down to the really core of genuine believers in this battle. And so after having thinned out the army adequately, what do they do when they go to the city they are wanting to attack? The first thing, obviously, to do is to offer peace terms, because all of the power, divine in particular, is on Israel's side. And therefore there is no doubt about the outcome of the battle, according to Deuteronomy. And if it accepts your terms of peace and surrenders to you, then all the people in it shall serve you at forced labor. If it does not submit to you peacefully, but makes war against you, then you shall besiege it. And when the Lord your God gives it into your hand, notice there's no doubt about the outcome for Deuteronomy, you will put all of its males to the sword. You may, however, take as your booty the women and children, livestock, and everything else in the town, all of its spoil. You may enjoy the spoil of your enemies, which the Lord your God has given you. So we've got the first example in Deuteronomy, in theory at least, of a sort of divine war, which comes over into the Western tradition as holy war. This is what was at the root of the Crusades in the Middle Ages, among other dreadful pieces of our history that we have managed to suppress. So the idea that God is directly responsible for victory in war certainly is here in Deuteronomy. This does not seem to be, as it is described, a very sensible way to make war. I mean, how would this work as a kind of foreign policy? Would it allow for the survival of Israel? Well, hang on. When we get to Joshua, we're going to see this in operation. And they are not really going to tell us much about the conquest of the land, but they will give us some examples of what happens when Israel obeys the holy war laws of Deuteronomy, and what happens when they do not. And that's all they're going to tell us by way of example. The rest of it is all kind of summary. So with that, we'll move on to the question of the conquest. I want to say a little in a kind of introductory way about the theories that have been raised by various people about the conquest and how it might have taken place. There are basically three theories that for a long time pretty much occupied the attention of people. You will have readings on this. I don't need to go into it in great detail. If you read the book of Joshua, it looks as if there is what scholars used to call a rapid conquest theory. And the rapid conquest really basically had three very quick miraculous phases to it. There is the beginning at Jericho, as soon as the people cross over into the land, a quick thrust to the center of the land, chapters 7 through 9, then moving on to the south in chapter 10, and the north in chapter 11 of Joshua. And then, according to Joshua, all of the area was under control of the Israelites. There used to be thought to be some archaeological evidence of this, but that has been disputed in recent days. There seems to be some destruction of 13th century cities, which is about when they are dating the conquest in the 1200s, basically. But there are certainly problems with a lot of the sites that are supposed to have been captured. So this biblical picture in Joshua has not been thought to be all that accurate in recent years. The second theory is a kind of slow conquest theory, an infiltration theory, if you like. This may be mentioned in Joshua 13 through 26, 13:26, 15:13, and so on, where it looks as if individual tribes conquered various cities. So there was a kind of slow conquest. Mostly we see this in the first chapter of Judges, where we are told that there are large portions of the land that the Israelites have occupied that are still not in Israelite control, and this, according to Deuteronomy, is a major problem. The Deuteronomistic historian sees that lack of control to be opportunity for introducing the practices of the foreign nations, which the book of Deuteronomy warned people against. So there is this slow conquest theory out there. Finally, in recent years, say beginning around the 70s, there was a notion of a peasant revolt model, which is associated with the name of George Mendenhall and Norman Gottwald. This is somewhat more complex than either of the other two theories, and is really a kind of combination of them in some ways. It holds that the early Israelites were semi-nomads who moved between the desert and the cultivated land. There is archaeological support for this. The first efforts at colonizing anything but the coastal cities in Israel apparently are associated with the northern highlands. And you can read in your historical survey, Hayes and Miller, what the most recent on that is. Eventually, they move in and out of the cities, but are not happy in the cities for one reason or another. They eventually make common cause with what Mendenhall describes as the riffraff of the cities. Mendenhall comes from a rural area originally in Michigan, and doesn't much like cities anyway, I think. And so the riffraff of the cities and the people, the riffraff of the cities, want to flee the oppression of the cities, and eventually they make common cause with the peasants who are coming in from who knows where and settling these hill towns around Israel and making common cause, and there is a peasants' revolt which eventually takes over the cities that later become part of Israel. People from the hill towns bring with them the worship of Yahweh, which they picked up in the Exodus, and celebrate to use Norman Gottwald's image, celebrate the God who liberates slaves. And that leads finally to the whole land being under the control of Israel. The problem with Mendenhall's theory is that there is no particular evidence that we can find that those cities that he's talking about were particularly oppressive. In fact, there is a good bit of interaction between the hill country towns and the cities. The hill country towns, as one might expect, have agricultural produce, and once in a while artisan work, gold work, iron work eventually, and so on, bronze work before that, which requires markets, upscale markets, and the cities then and now were the upscale markets for things like this. So the farmers in the hill towns would raise house-fed beef, what we would call veal, that is the fatted calf of the New Testament, is an animal that is not allowed to graze in the field, but is kept in the house, which keeps the beef tender. It's also labor intensive and very expensive, and the only place for a market for that sort of thing would be the cities, where there are other forms of income. So the agricultural system seems to have been, in fact, an interaction between the cities on the periphery and the towns sorry, not the cities, but the settlements on the periphery and the towns. So basically, this kind of unity that Mendenhall sought, of course he sees it in the covenant. He puts a great deal of stock in the covenant. The covenant is probably not that pervasive in the early period, in spite of Mendenhall's efforts to make it that way. And there is no central worship of Yahweh in this early period. That's what Deuteronomy is up to, is trying to centralize the worship of Yahweh. So what do we have what does early Israel look like? Well, I've drawn a picture of it on the board there. That thing at the bottom is a lineage or family, and that seems to be the basis of the social structure. You've got 2, 3, or maybe even in some cases 4 generations of people who make up a nuclear or extended family. And you can begin to talk about those lineage structures as capable of going even deeper. And the notion of the Israelite tribes is in fact an expression of this kind of social organization. There they trace the tribes to their tribal ancestors, and the whole notion is that you can describe in familial terms all of Israel, and we've seen this in the narratives about the children of Jacob or Israel, and you have their names and the different genealogies that show you how they were all related to each other. These structures relate people to each other horizontally and to a limited number of generations vertically. I put it that way because although in theory you can come up with a much more extensive genealogy, and the biblical genealogy of the tribes is such a genealogy, but in real terms you can't go much deeper than 3 generations before you cease to get to living individuals. And once you cease to get to living individuals, then the question of enforcing power, whether it is social or political, in one of these lineage structures gets to be a major one. So lineage systems of the sort that Israel had, and some other people around there too, the Moabites seem to have had the same structure, the Ammonites, who were always called the Bnei Ammon, the children of Ammon, are all organized in this kind of lineage structure. So they are mostly individual families, and we will see when we get into the book of Judges that organizing them for any particular purpose is always a problem. And so the answer to the question of what kind of unity did early Israel have, and why is Deuteronomy, as we'll see, so impressed or insistent on unity, one people, how does one achieve one people when they are made up of all of these small fragmentary units? And it is probably the case that early Israel is not, in fact, a unified territory, except under certain conditions, usually military conditions, when occasional rulers of one sort or another, which the anthropologists tend to call chiefs in a system like this, are temporarily given political power in order to achieve an overall goal. And when we get to the stories of the rise of the monarchy, when we get to the story of the judges, we'll see figures that look an awful lot like these early chief figures who arise in a situation of crisis. Otherwise, the people are living in these small villages. They live in four-room houses, and I've drawn a four-room house up there. A four-room house can accommodate a nuclear family. About 6 people max can live in a four-room house. And there is very little evidence of compounding of houses, that is, having multiple houses together that would indicate we've got a larger family unit. Such things may have existed, but they have not left us much on the ground. So unity in Israel remains a problem well into the monarchical period, and as we'll see when we get to the stories about the rise of the monarchy, there are many occasions where the unity fragments and creates all sorts of problems. We'll see this in the Saul period, we'll see it in David's time, and we'll see it later on in Saul's day as his empire finally crashes. So we'll pick that up. Next time I want to talk about Joshua and the conquest, and then we'll get into Judges as the Deuteronomist sees those books.